It's time to take a deep dive into famous source code. We're going to take all that we've learned and see if we can't use it to understand the structure and style of famous, well-used open source code. The library, perhaps the most famous JavaScript library there is jQuery. We're going to examine it. We're going to dive into its source code. We're not going to try to understand how every feature is implemented, but we're going to try to see, one, if we can read the code, and two, if we can learn from how it's structured, if we can gain some knowledge and some techniques and borrow some ideas from inside the source code of jQuery. If you've done any JavaScript coding or any web development in general, to be honest, you're probably at least familiar with jQuery. If not, jQuery is a JavaScript library that doesn't add any features to the browser or to JavaScript itself. It's just a JavaScript library. What it does do is make it easier to type syntactically, to write certain things, and it deals with cross-browser issues, meaning that each browser, Firefox, Safari, Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, and various mobile versions of these browsers, all have their quirks and differences. jQuery handles those, so you don't have to worry about it. You just are doing what you want to do, and the code inside of jQuery is handling the browser quirks. What jQuery does, essentially, is lets you manipulate the DOM. The DOM is the document object model inside a browser. It's separate from the JavaScript engine. It's the thing that lets the browser look at HTML and decide how to render it or paint it on the screen. And JavaScript has access to the DOM. It can manipulate it. It can manipulate the structure of an HTML page after it's been loaded by manipulating the DOM that's in memory. That is this tree-like structure that houses or stores a representation of your HTML that's used to paint or render on the screen. jQuery then makes it easy to look at that tree, to look at the DOM, to find things, to find elements on your page and manipulate them. So what is it that we actually get when we use jQuery? Well, if I just have a variable, let's say Q, jQuery has a $sign for its name that you can use, or you can use the word jQuery. We'll use $sign because it's less typing. And then you pass it a string. You give it a string. Now what I've set up is a very basic HTML page that has our jQuery reference. At the time of the recording of this course, we're using jQuery 1.11.2. You can use the latest if you like. And then I have my app.js after the fact. Also note that jQuery has a 2.0 version, but that isn't more up to date. The 2.0 version doesn't bother with some really old browsers, so it removes some code that's there for really old browsers. If your project doesn't have to worry about that, then you might as well not have all that extra code in the library. We're just going to use 1.11.2, and that's the one that we're going to examine. And even if we're looking at a later version of jQuery by the time you take this course, the basic structure will still be valid. I've set up a div with an ID and a class attribute, and I've set up a header and an unordered list with 3 items in it. If you aren't familiar with HTML, don't worry. This isn't a huge requirement for this lecture. We're going to look at the source code of jQuery itself, but we just wanted to understand what it does. So if I refresh this here, I have a header and 3 items in the list. That's what this did. So in jQuery now, what's happened is this is now sitting in reality in a tree-like representation in memory inside the browser. And JavaScript has access to all of these. This would be a parent, and then a child, then a grandchild, and on down the line. These are parent and child kind of relationships. So jQuery lets me do something like UL, and that would find me all ULs inside the tree. And I can even search for a specific one, like all ULs that have a class people. And all ULs that have a class people, I want to find all the LIs that are children of ULs that have a class people. If you're familiar with CSS, jQuery is essentially letting you query the tree just like you would in CSS. All right, let's see what we get when we run this, when we get this object back from jQuery, having passed in what I'm looking for. I'll refresh and open my console. Interesting. I get an object of type jQuery.fn.init, not just jQuery. And it looks to be an array, or at least array-like. It has a 0, and that's my LIs, my second LI, and my third LI. And each LI is an element, what's called a DOM element. It's got things like inner HTML, inner text. This is just a standard browser element. Nothing special there, but it did find them and gave them to me. Let's look at my __proto__. That's a jQuery object, and if I open it up, it has a whole bunch of methods on it. So remember how we said it's better to put methods on the prototype to save memory space? Well, here it is. We have a prototype that has a huge number of features and functionality that make jQuery so popular. All kind of stuff we can do. So in some way, we're getting back an array with a prototype that has a whole lot of features, a whole lot of methods on it, things that we can do then with this object. All right. And it's kind of unusual that we're seeing .fn.init. That's a little unexpected. What is that? Well, let's see how this is structured. And also note that we didn't use the new operator. We just said $, and passed a string. Let's see how this is working under the hood. I've downloaded the unminified development version of jQuery. So let's just open it. And here it is. Pretty huge with lots of comments. Because of all those comments and it's unminified, it's over 10,000 lines long. We're not going to go through all of these lines. Let's look and see if we can find things that look familiar, if we can understand its structure and see what we can learn. No, wait a minute. I have a challenge for you. Before we go through the rest of this lecture and the rest of this section, stop right here, pause this video, and go take a look at jQuery for yourself. You have the tools to understand a lot of what you're seeing. Maybe not everything, but don't be afraid. Don't be intimidated by the amount of code. There is very few things in here that you haven't seen in this course already. So I challenge you to stop and take a look around inside the jQuery source code. Look at the structure. See if you can find the immediately invoked function expressions, where we're using object literal syntax. Head toward the bottom of it and see if you can understand how it's exposed in the global object. Find where the jQuery.fn.init is being used, and what does that mean? We're going to go through all of that. But my challenge is to pause right now and take a look for yourself. Ready? Go for it. All right, are you back? Let's keep going. For starters, it has a nice introductory comment. And then, what's the first thing we see? You guessed it. It's an immediately invoked function expression. It's using the parenthesis to trick the syntax parser into treating this as a function expression. So it's wrapping those entire lines, all the features of jQuery, inside a function call. So that makes sense. The function itself takes two parameters, global and factory. Well, that makes sense. We did that before, deciding what is the global object. In fact, if I look here, it's checking for something called module and using the type of. We've seen that. It's checking to see if module is an object and module.exports is an object. And the comment tells us this is for common JS-like environments or Node.js. So it looks like what it's doing is it's checking to see what the environment is that jQuery is living in, and then making certain decisions about how to work with the global object in those cases. We don't need to worry about this too much then. Let's see where it actually calls. Well, actually it calls this function. There, it's immediately invoked. So it immediately invokes this here and passes as the global. See this? There's the global, and here's where it's invoking this function expression. It's checking to see if there's a window object. So that's neat. We understand that in the browser, the global object is window. So if window is not equal to undefined, oh, this is a ternary operator. It takes three parameters. The first parameter is a Boolean. If the Boolean is true, it returns this. If the Boolean is false, then it returns whatever's on the other side of the colon. So it's saying if window is not equal to undefined, and notice it uses the strict not going to coerce not equals, because it's not double equals. If window is not undefined, then pass window to this global. Otherwise, pass whatever this is pointing to, which would be the global object in whatever environment you're sitting in, maybe Node.js or something. And then it passes a factory, and it looks like that factory is what's returned in this case. So this is actually the function expression that wraps a whole bunch of code. See that? So this is just taking care of where is jQuery sitting, and this is actually the jQuery code. All right, so this is another function expression. This one is window and no global. Let's try to remember that. But we do know that we're getting the window object at some point in here when this factory is actually being invoked. See that? It's invoked up there, and it's being passed in to this function here. This function expression is being passed to factory, and factory is being invoked at some point. All right, so what happens when this is invoked? Well, it sets up some variables in this new execution context. See that? When factory is invoked, which ends up being this function object that's passed in, I get a new execution context, and it starts creating some variables. All right, here's the important one here. Let's see. jQuery. We know that's the one that we can use in our code in order to call this. And as expected, it's a function. And it takes a selector and a context. Well, we've already used the selector. That's what jQuery calls that string where you're passing in what HTML elements you're trying to find. So that's neat. But I'm surprised here that I don't have a bunch of code. Instead, it's returning and then using the new operator, jQuery.fn.init. Oh, well, remember, when we created a jQuery object in here and console.logged it, remember what that was. It was a jQuery.fn.init. So this makes sense. The jQuery function isn't a function constructor. It's just a function. That's why we don't have to use the new operator. All it is a function that returns an object, but it does return an object by calling a function constructor. See that? It uses the new keyword. So it keeps me from having to use the new keyword myself all the time and possibly forgetting it when using jQuery. That's a neat trick. A function that returns a call to a function constructor keeps me from having to use the new keyword myself when I use jQuery. All right, so let's keep that in mind. So somewhere down the line, we're going to find out that this somewhere is a function constructor. Some init function constructor sitting on some fn object, which will be sitting on this jQuery object. All right, so moving on, let's see if we can find, oh, here we go. jQuery.fn, there it is. What is it? Well, it's a reference. Remember that these are objects and therefore they're passed by reference. So fn is pointing at the same memory spot as the prototype property of the jQuery function. Remember, all functions get a .prototype property, which is used if they're used as a function constructor. But it's really just hanging out there. Even though we're not using this as a function constructor, it's still there. It's just an empty object. So it's using this empty object and having an alias for it. I guess that's just so it doesn't have to type .prototype all the time. We can just type .fn. It's a lot faster to type. All right, so when we see .fn, we need to remember that this just means function prototype. The prototype property on this function, the same prototype property all functions get. And it's being overwritten with a new object. See the object literal syntax? It's creating a bunch of name-value pairs, a bunch of properties. All right, so if we go down, let's see what's inside this jQuery.fn that has all of these properties. Well, we have some things we're not going to worry about too much. Well, here's some things we've seen: each and map using a callback. So you're passing a callback to a function. And look, on map, for example, it does callback.call. So it's invoking whatever function you give it in the map and probably acting on that element. Well, that's kind of like our map for each, remember? It's calling back whatever we give it on some list of things. All right, we'll just go on because it looks like there's some other deeper functions that do this. So it started off with this object that has these properties. What's the next thing I see? Well, this is interesting. Another double reference, so essentially an aliasing, giving two names to the same function. It's a function object. We got a function expression here, and it's called extend. Hey, I bet that's the same concept that we saw in underscore. So it's being added to the .fn and to jQuery itself as a reference to this one single function. And inside it, it looks like it's doing some kind of deep copy and adding on objects. Yeah, this is the same as the underscore essentially that we saw, where it's adding things to an object. It's taking properties and methods off one object and adding them to another. So it's looking at the arguments.length, so I probably can pass in as many objects as I want. Let's see. And yeah, we have a for loop on the length, so on all of the arguments. So if I pass in a bunch of objects as arguments to this function as parameters, it'll go through all of them and add all of their, yeah, see the for in? So if I add 3 objects, for example, to this extend function, I'll end up with a length of 3, and it'll find each argument, and then it'll go through using for in that we saw before. It's using reflection to go through all of the properties and methods of every object that I add or that I passed in to this function. And what is it doing with this for in, for name? So we need to find wherever name is used and see what it's doing. Well, it's doing a source and a copy. So without getting too much into what it's doing, it basically looks like it's doing what we said. It's adding on properties and methods of an object to an object. that's interesting. We have a target, and our target is, what is our target? Oh, our target is our first argument. So the first thing we pass to extend is what we want to actually extend, where we want to drop these properties and methods, which object is receiving them. And the rest of the parameters are which objects hold them. So we're adding all of the other parameters to the first one. All right, so that's neat. So source is where we're copying our methods and properties to. And so it's adding a new method and property. But it's using extend again, probably because objects can hold other objects. So it's making sure that every possible method and property, even of sub-objects, is being added onto our target. All right, so we have this really cool extend method that's really serious. I mean, it does a good job of extending. And we can pass it an object or even sub-objects, and I'll get all those methods and properties on my target object where I want them to be. In fact, right away it uses it. Look at that. It calls extend and adds methods and properties to the jQuery object. Neat. Okay, so wait a minute. Wasn't the first argument the target? Let's see. What else can we learn here?